The night someone died in the private dining room of Maison Levesque, Darcy Ouellet was the only one who didn't run. Everyone else scattered. The sommelier knocked over an entire rack of Burgundy, trying to get through the kitchen door. The hostess was sobbing into her blazer in the coat closet, and the two junior servers had simply evaporated into the Montreal cold without even grabbing their coats. Darcy stood at the edge of the room with a tray of untouched foie gras and watched the man at the head of table 7 register what had just happened with the absolute stillness of someone who had seen worse. His name was Callum Voss. She knew that the way she knew a lot of things she was never supposed to know, because people with money and power have a habit of speaking freely in front of the staff. Not because they trust the staff, because they don't see the staff at all. Darcy had been working the private room at Maison Levesque for 3 years by then. She was 26 years old, 5'4", and 270 pounds on a good day, which meant she moved through the world the way most heavy women learn to move through it, efficiently, quietly, and with the constant low-grade awareness that she was taking up space somebody probably resented. She wore the same black uniform as everyone else. She kept her dark hair pinned back. She smiled when it was required and vanished when it wasn't. In a restaurant where the private dining room hosted city councillors and real estate developers, and men whose business card said one thing and whose actual business was something else entirely, being invisible had a way of making you extremely well-informed. She knew that Maison Levesque was used 4 times a year by the Voss syndicate for what they called operational dinners, which was the kind of phrase that meant absolutely nothing and also meant everything. She knew that Callum Voss always ordered the duck. She knew he never finished his wine. She knew he tipped exactly 20%, not more, not less, and that he was the only person in his orbit who ever said thank you to the person clearing his plate. What she didn't know, not until that particular Thursday in November, was that the man seated to his left, a soft-jawed real estate lawyer named Fletcher Guard, had been planning to kill him. It didn't happen the way she expected violence to happen, which is to say it didn't announce itself. There was no raised voice, no drawn weapon, no dramatic confrontation. Fletcher Guard simply reached into the breast pocket of his jacket during what looked like a casual adjustment of his pocket square, and when his hand came back out and rested briefly on the edge of Callum's water glass, Darcy caught the motion from 8 feet away because she was already watching the table. Not because she was suspicious of Fletcher, but because the bread course was running 4 minutes behind and she'd been timing her approach. The white powder dissolved before the glass was even fully settled back on the linen. Darcy's brain went very quiet in the way it did sometimes, the way it had learned to when her father lost work, and the heat went out, and she was the oldest of 4, and somebody had to figure something out. She didn't think about heroism. She didn't think about what Callum Voss was or wasn't. She thought about angles and timing, and the fact that Lena from the pastry station was 22 years old and had no idea what kind of room she was walking into when she came through that door with the dessert cart. Darcy moved. She came around the side of the table with her tray, perfectly calibrated. Too fast would look deliberate. Too slow would be too late. And when she reached past Callum's shoulder to refresh the bread basket she'd already replaced twice that evening, she caught the water glass with the back of her wrist. A clean sweep. It shattered against the side table, water spreading across the white linen, and Darcy gasped in the specific register of a woman who hated herself for making a scene, pressing her hand to her mouth, already apologizing before anyone had time to process what she'd done. Fletcher Guard went absolutely rigid. "I am so sorry, I'm so sorry, let me." She was already moving, stacking napkins over the mess, using the motion to sweep the broken glass onto her tray, the largest pieces and the water both. "I'll have fresh settings in 30 seconds, I'm so sorry, Mr. Voss." "It's fine," Callum said. "Not it's fine, get out of my sight. not the dismissal she'd braced for. He said it calmly, watching her with the kind of attention that made the back of her neck prickle, and she understood in that moment that whatever this man was, he was not careless. She retreated to the service corridor and stood there for 4 seconds with the tray against her chest, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her molars. Then she dumped the broken glass into the wastebin, ran the hot tap over everything until she was satisfied, and picked up a fresh place setting. When she walked back out, Callum Voss had moved his chair slightly, barely an inch, barely noticeable, so that his left side was no longer directly beside Fletcher Guard. He knew she hadn't tripped. The dinner ended 20 minutes later. Fletcher Guard made his excuses and left early. The other 2 men at the table followed shortly after. Callum remained, as he sometimes did, finishing the last of his water. Fresh water, new glass. Darcy had personally poured it, while his security detail waited near the door. Darcy was stripping the far end of the table when she heard him say her name. Not hey or miss or the small throat-clearing noise men used when they wanted something, and didn't feel like acknowledging that a person was attached to the service. Her name, Darcy, which meant he'd read her name tag at some point during the 3 years she'd been working this room, and had kept it, and she'd had absolutely no idea. "Sit down," Callum said. It wasn't a request, but it also wasn't the particular kind of not a request that made her want to run. She sat in the chair across from him, the one Fletcher Guard had been sitting in 20 minutes ago, and she folded her hands on the table and waited. Callum studied her for a long moment. He was somewhere north of 40, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that had probably been conventionally handsome once, and was now something more interesting, more settled. He had grey coming in at his temples, and a thin scar running through his left eyebrow that nobody had ever explained in any of the conversations she'd overheard in this room. "You didn't slip," he said. "The floor near the side table gets slippery when—" "Darcy." His voice didn't rise. It just landed with a particular weight. "I watched your eyes before you moved. You were looking at Fletcher's hand, then you were looking at my glass." She said nothing. "Fletcher Guard has been my family's solicitor for 11 years, Callum continued, as if they were discussing something entirely ordinary. "He manages 6 of our shell corporations and has signing authority on 2 accounts I can't publicly attach my name to. He also, as of 8 weeks ago, started taking meetings with the Beaumont family, which I know because I pay a great deal of money for exactly that kind of information." He tilted his head slightly. "What did you see?" Darcy looked at her hands, then she looked up. "He reached into his jacket during the bread course. His hand was on your glass for less than 2 seconds. Something dissolved." She paused. "I don't know what." "Something white." Callum nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already calculated. "You could have said nothing. You could have screamed. You could have walked out the back with everyone else." He leaned forward slightly. "Instead, you broke a $40 crystal glass and took the verbal heat for it without flinching. Why?" Darcy thought about that. "Because if I'd screamed," she said, "your men would have drawn their weapons. And Lena from Pastry was about to walk through that door with a dessert cart. And she's 22, and she's trying to save up for her sister's tuition, and she has nothing to do with any of this." She held his gaze. And because the mess would have been easier to explain than a dead body in the private room. Callum was quiet for a long moment. "That's a very practical reason to save someone's life," he said. "I'm a practical person. I can see that." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and she couldn't help noticing, that his movement was slow and deliberate, and he watched her watch him do it, which was a strange small courtesy, and set a business card on the linen between them. It was cream-colored and had nothing on it but a phone number. "I'd like to speak with you tomorrow. Somewhere that isn't here." She looked at the card. She didn't touch it. "I work the lunch service tomorrow," she said. "I'll have someone cover your shift. You don't know who my manager is. I know who owns this restaurant." Callum said, and then with something that might have been the earliest edge of a smile, "He owes me a favor." She took the card. The car that came for her the next morning was black and large, and had a driver who didn't introduce himself, which she'd half expected. What she hadn't expected was to be taken not to some unmarked building in the industrial East End of Montreal, but to a restaurant. A different one, smaller in Outremont, with linen tablecloths and afternoon light coming through tall windows and a menu that was written on a chalkboard and changed daily. Callum Voss was already seated when she arrived. He stood when she came in, which was the kind of thing that seemed small and was actually not small at all when you were a woman who spent most of her working life being waved at like a piece of furniture. He asked her about herself, which no one in his position had ever bothered to do with her. She told him the short version. Grew up in Verdun, mother worked nights at a pharmaceutical packaging facility, 4 kids, Darcy the oldest, community college for 2 years before money ran out, restaurant work because it paid cash and the hours were flexible, and she'd been good at it, better than she'd expected to be. She had a memory for orders and a tolerance for difficult people and, as it turned out, an eye for things that didn't add up. "That last part," Callum said. "Tell me more about that." She thought about how to say it. "People talk in front of me," she said finally. "They always have. I think they assume." She paused. "I think they look at me and they see someone who's not paying attention, or who wouldn't understand, or who doesn't matter enough to be careful around. So they're not careful." She shrugged, a small, tight movement. "I've spent a long time paying attention to things people assumed I wasn't paying attention to." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you know what Fletcher Guard's connection to the Beaumont family actually is?" "Property," she said. "Commercial properties in Rosemont and in the Plateau that were bought through numbered companies 18 months ago. The Beaumonts needed clean paper on them. Fletcher could provide that through the Voss corporate structure without anyone flagging it, because the Voss name keeps auditors polite." She watched his expression carefully. "There were documents on the table 3 dinners ago. You left the room for 9 minutes to take a call. Fletcher didn't put the folder away. The silence that followed was the longest one she'd ever sat inside of. "I need someone," Callum said at last, "who can be in rooms I can't be in. Not a soldier, not an analyst. Someone who operates below the line of attention. Someone my enemies will look straight through." He met her eyes. "I think you've been doing this your whole life without getting paid for it." She should have said no. She knew that. She was 26 years old, and she served duck confit for a living, and her safety deposit on her apartment in NDG was 4 months overdue, and what he was describing was not a thing that cautious, sensible people agreed to. "What happens," she said carefully, "if someone figures out what I'm doing?" "They won't." "But if they do?" Callum looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet, though she would learn it later, that particular stillness that meant he was being more honest than he usually allowed himself to be. "Then I have a problem," he said. "Because you'll be the most valuable person in my operation, and I protect what's valuable." She looked out the window at the street. A woman walked past, pushing a stroller, completely unaware of the conversation happening on the other side of the glass. The ordinary world moving at its ordinary pace. "I want a contract," Darcy said. "Not in writing. I want your word in specific terms about what I'm agreeing to and what I'm not." Something shifted in Callum's expression. "All right," he said. She named her terms. He accepted 3, negotiated 1, and held firm on the last, which she respected more than she would have respected him simply agreeing to everything. Men who agreed to everything were not men who kept their word. For the next month, Darcy's life rearranged itself in ways she could not have described to anyone she knew. Callum moved her out of her apartment in NDG, not out of sentimentality, he was clear about that, but because Fletcher Guard was still operational, and still nervous, and nervous men made mistakes that splashed. and into a furnished suite in a building in Westmount that had a doorman and in-unit laundry and windows that were actually double-glazed, which she noticed because she'd spent 3 winters in apartments where the cold came straight through the glass. She expected the Voss world to feel like a film. She expected the money and the danger to be loud, declarative, the way it always was in the stories people told about men like Callum. Instead, it was quieter than her ordinary life in some ways, controlled. The people around Callum moved with purpose and spoke in measured sentences, and nobody wasted anything, not time or words or trust. He gave her access to things carefully, in layers. He explained what he needed and why, and he asked her opinion on operational details with a directness that kept surprising her, because she kept expecting him to perform, to remind her, subtly, that she was working for him. He never did. What he did instead was introduce her, at a dinner with 4 of his senior people, as someone whose judgment he trusted. Not as his assistant, not as a new hire, not with any qualifier, just her name and the statement, "Her judgment is good, and I'd like you to treat it accordingly." Not everyone received this gracefully. Darcy noticed it first in a man named Hallward, mid-50s, operations, tight jaw, who addressed every comment to Callum even when Darcy was the one who'd spoken. She noticed it in the way questions were sometimes routed around her rather than to her, the way a polite fiction was maintained in certain rooms that she was decorative rather than functional. She filed it all away. Men who needed to pretend she wasn't a factor were men who were worried about something. It was Hallward, she eventually understood, who was worried about the most. The annual St. Jean-Baptiste fundraiser gala at the Ritz-Carlton in June was the kind of event that existed to give powerful people a place to be seen being charitable. Callum's foundation donated a significant sum every year. He attended, his people attended, and, new this year, Darcy attended. Callum had a dress sent to her 2 days before, not delivered with instructions, just sent in her size, in a deep forest green that she would not have chosen for herself, and that was exactly right for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. She wore it and stood in front of the mirror in the Westmount suite and felt, for the first time in a long time, like the dress was trying to work with her body rather than apologize for it. At the gala, she played the part she was best at. She let her posture soften. She accepted a glass of sparkling water and drifted toward the edges of the room, the way large women at formal events were expected to drift, a little uncertain, a little underdressed even when they weren't, looking for a chair, a wall, a potted plant to anchor herself to. The assembled donors and politicians and lawyers barely clocked her. She was background. She was furniture. She positioned herself near the terrace doors, where the noise of the room thinned out and voices from the corridor beyond carried clearly. Hallward emerged from a side hallway 20 minutes into the cocktail hour, phone pressed to his ear, moving with the quick, forward-leaning walk of a man managing a timeline. He turned left into the small alcove off the main hall, the one she'd noted on her way in, the one with the dead angle from the security cameras, the one that caught the ambient sound from the terrace. She didn't follow him. She didn't need to. She heard him clearly from where she was standing. He wasn't on the phone. He was speaking to someone. A second voice, low and accented, that she placed after a moment as belonging to a man she'd seen twice before, at events she'd attended on Callum's behalf. A man named Deschaines, who Callum believed was an impartial city mediator, and who Darcy had watched, at 2 separate functions, exchange the particular kind of sustained eye contact with Hallward that meant an existing understanding. What Hallward was saying, in the quiet and specific language of someone who had been planning for a long time, was that the Voss financial accounts held with Banque Laurentienne under 3 separate corporate registrations were going to be flagged to the RCMP's Financial Crimes Division by end of month, that the information had been packaged carefully, attributed to an anonymous internal source, and that by the time Callum's lawyers had unwound it, The operational freeze alone would cripple the network for 6 months. Long enough for the Beaumont family to move on the Eastern port contracts that had been Callum's anchor for 8 years. Fletcher Guard had been the first move. This was the real one. Darcy set her glass of sparkling water down on a nearby ledge and walked back into the main room. She found Callum near the silent auction tables, speaking with a federal MP, whose name she recognized from a conversation overheard 11 months ago in the private room at Maison Levesque. She touched Callum's arm, a gesture she had never used before, because she'd been careful about not presuming. And when he looked down at her, she held his gaze for a moment and then looked briefly toward the far end of the room. Their signal was a nod. She'd proposed it. He'd agreed to it. They'd tested it once. She used it now. He excused himself from the MP with the smooth economy of someone who had been managing exits from conversations for 30 years and followed her to the private cloakroom off the east corridor. She told him everything, verbatim or as close as memory allowed, which for Darcy was close enough. She watched his face while she spoke. The control there was extraordinary. She'd watched him receive bad news before, and she'd learned that his anger didn't live on the surface. It went somewhere internal and compressed, like pressure building in a sealed system. What she saw now was that particular compression, and underneath it, something else. Something that looked briefly like relief, but not the relief of a problem being solved. The relief of someone who had been alone inside a calculation for a long time and had finally found the calculation confirmed. "Hallward has been with me for 16 years, Callum said. "I know," Darcy said. He looked at her. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain of what I heard. What you do with it is your decision." Another silence. Then he asked with a quiet that she recognized as the most serious version of the question. "Is there anything else? Anything you've held back because you weren't sure of it?" She'd been waiting for a version of this question. She answered it honestly, which meant she told him about 3 other things, smaller, not urgent, not what tonight was about, that she'd been holding until she had confirmation. She gave him those too. When she finished, Callum was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Wait here." He was gone for 45 minutes. She sat in the cloakroom on a narrow bench between 2 racks of coats and listened to the muffled sounds of the gala continuing beyond the wall and thought about what her mother would say if she could see her daughter right now. She honestly wasn't sure. Her mother was a practical woman too. Practicality ran in the family. When the gala ended and the crowd thinned to its last quarter, Callum came back. He looked the same as he'd looked before, tuxedo unrumpled, expression composed, except for something in his bearing that was different, a kind of settled finality, as if a weight had been redistributed. He offered her his arm. She looked at it. "What happened?" "Nothing that touches you," he said, "and nothing that can't be confirmed in the morning papers, if they bother to run it." He held her gaze. "Come out with me." She took his arm. The main hall of the Ritz-Carlton was still half full. Donors collecting coats, the tail end of conversations, servers clearing the last of the champagne flutes. Callum walked through it unhurriedly, and Darcy walked beside him, and she registered the moment people began to track them. Not her, not the way people usually tracked her, but them, as a unit, as something that required an explanation they didn't have. He stopped in the center of the hall. Not theatrically. He simply stopped and turned to face her. And when the people nearest to them paused in their conversations and looked over, he spoke at a volume that carried clearly without being raised. "Hallward tried to dismantle this network from inside it," Callum said, to her and not to the room, which somehow made the room listen harder. "He's been building that play for 2 years, and he nearly managed it. He would have, if not for you." He looked at her directly, with the particular quality of attention she'd noticed the first night, the attention that saw rather than looked. "You heard what his people were planning before I did. You've heard things I couldn't have positioned anyone else to hear. You have been doing the most important work in this operation, and I have not said that loudly enough." She heard the intake of breath from somewhere to her left. Someone recognizing what they were witnessing. "I don't do this publicly," Callum continued, his voice quieter now, only for her. "I don't explain my structure to rooms full of people I don't trust, but I want them to understand what I understand." He glanced, briefly, at the assembled observers, and there was something cold and precise in that glance. That the most dangerous person in my world has been the one they didn't think to watch. He held out his hand, not to lead her away, not to steer her, just extended it, open, waiting. Darcy Ouellet, who had spent 26 years taking up space in a world that would have preferred she didn't, looked at Callum Voss's hand, and then at Callum Voss, and reached out and took it. The hall was very quiet. Somewhere near the entrance, a woman who had looked through Darcy 3 times that evening whispered something to the man beside her, and Darcy didn't hear what it was and found, for the first time in a long time, that she didn't need to. She already knew what the room was thinking. She had always known what the room was thinking. That was the whole point.